Have you ever been judged unfairly simply because of the way you look? Maybe at a store, a restaurant, or even your own bank. If you've ever felt the weight of someone's assumptions pressing down on you, let us know in the comments. Now let's get into this unbelievable story. Jordan Carter adjusted the strap of her leather tote bag as she stepped through the gleaming glass doors of Carter Financial, her own bank. To anyone watching, she was just another customer, a woman dressed in simple, everyday attire, jeans, a fitted blazer, and a pair of sneakers. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, nothing that screamed wealth or power. And that was the point. Jordan made these unannounced visits often, slipping into her branches unnoticed. It was one thing to receive pristine reports from her executive team, polished statements filled with numbers and projections, but something else entirely to stand in the heart of her business and witness, firsthand, how her customers were treated. The bank was alive with the hum of quiet transactions. Customers shuffled forward in orderly lines, some tapping away at their phones, others staring blankly at the slow-moving queue. Jordan's gaze swept across the tellers behind the counter, her sharp mind making quick assessments. A young black woman assisting an elderly customer, her face warm with patience. A Latino teller engaged in polite conversation with a woman in a crisp business suit. Everything seemed to be running smoothly. Then her eyes landed on a teller stationed at the farthest window, a young white man, early 20s at most. His posture exuded impatience, as if he had somewhere more important to be. The name tag pinned to his uniform read Jason. Jordan stepped into his line, her heart steady, though she was already bracing herself for what might come. She had built Carter Financial with a vision, one that stood on the pillars of fairness, inclusion, and dignity. This was supposed to be a place where black and brown customers, so often disregarded or mistreated at other banks, could feel respected. And yet here she was, testing her own system, wondering what she would uncover today. By the time she reached the counter, she had already sensed it. The shift in Jason's demeanor, the disinterest in his eyes, the dismissiveness in his voice as he barely looked up. "Next," he said, monotone and impatient. Jordan stepped forward, placing her ID and bank card onto the counter. "Good afternoon. I'd like to make a withdrawal, $10,000 from my account." That got his attention. Jason's gaze snapped up, his expression shifting in an instant. Suspicion, annoyance. That look Jordan had encountered far too many times before. "You have an account here?" he asked, lifting her ID with hesitant fingers, as though it might disintegrate at his touch. Jordan kept her expression neutral. "Yes, I do." His brows pulled together. "And you said you were withdrawing. How much?" 10,000. His lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line. "I'll need to verify this." Jordan remained silent, watching him. She understood bank policies. Large withdrawals required security measures. That wasn't the issue. It was the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on her, waiting for her to stumble. Jason turned and strode over to a woman standing near the back, a middle-aged white woman with a rigid stance, her arms crossed over her chest like a gatekeeper of authority. The moment Jason leaned in to whisper to her, Jordan saw the shift in the woman's face. Her name tag read, Susan, the branch manager. Jordan didn't miss the way Susan's expression hardened, how her gaze flickered toward her before snapping back to Jason. Something was off. Susan approached, the sharp click, click, click of her heels slicing through the air. "Ma'am," she said, her voice laced with practiced authority, "before we can process this request, I'm going to need to ask you a few questions." Jordan inhaled slowly. "All right," she said evenly. "Go ahead." Susan's lips curved into a polite, tight-lipped smile. "May I ask the reason for your withdrawal?" Jordan blinked. That was not standard protocol. "Do I need to provide a reason?" Susan's smile remained, but her tone cooled. "We just want to ensure the legitimacy of all large transactions." Jordan folded her arms. "I'm withdrawing money from my own account." Susan cast a glance at Jason before returning her attention to Jordan. "Do you have proof of income to verify these funds?" Jordan felt the slow burn of irritation simmering beneath her skin. "Excuse me." Jason shifted behind the counter, arms crossed, a smug smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Susan let out a dramatic sigh. The kind reserved for people who believed they were being overly patient with someone they deemed unworthy of their time. "It's just an extra precaution," she said, her voice carefully measured. "We take special care when transactions appear unusual." There it was. Unusual. Jordan felt the pulse. In her jaw tick. The words settled over her like an old familiar weight. A reminder. A warning. She glanced at the line behind her. Customers had begun to notice, their murmurs rising, eyes flickering toward the unfolding scene. "Let me get this straight," Jordan said, her voice calm but unyielding. "You're telling me that I need to prove I have the right to withdraw my own money?" Susan's polite mask remained, though her jaw tightened at the edges. "It's standard policy, ma'am." Jordan didn't break eye contact. It's not." A flicker of something crossed Susan's face. Jason, now leaning casually against the counter, scoffed. "Look," he drawled, "if you can't provide verification, we'll have to deny the withdrawal." Jordan tapped her fingers against the counter, exhaling slowly. She could end this right now. One phone call. That's all it would take. She could have Susan and Jason escorted out of the building before the hour was up. But she wasn't done yet. "All right," she said finally, slipping her ID back into her wallet. Jason's smirk widened. He thought she had given up. Then Jordan straightened, her voice unwavering. "Go ahead and call the police." The smirk vanished. Susan's expression flickered with uncertainty. "Excuse me." Jordan tilted her head. "You believe I'm committing fraud, correct? You refuse to give me my own money because you think I don't belong here. So let's settle it. Call the police. Let's get this sorted out right now." A ripple of tension passed through the bank. Some customers shifted uncomfortably. Others watched in silence, their curiosity piqued. Near the entrance, Morris, the black security guard, straightened, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. Susan cleared her throat. "Ma'am, there's no need to escalate." Jordan cut her off. "I'm not escalating anything." Her voice was steady, firm, unshaken. Susan hesitated. Jason took a small step back. The power dynamic had shifted, and they both felt it. Jordan Carter had come here undercover, uncertain of what she might find. Now she had her answer, and she wasn't leaving without making sure everyone knew it. Jordan cut in, her voice steady but laced with an undeniable edge. "I just want you to follow through. If you truly believe I don't belong here, if you think this transaction is suspicious, then call law enforcement. Let's see how they feel about a black woman being denied access to her own money." Jason paled, his face draining of color as he darted a look at Susan, waiting for her lead. The confidence he had worn so brazenly just moments ago had all but vanished. Maurice, the black security guard, took a deliberate step forward, his voice calm yet firm. Susan, maybe we should verify her information in the system before making that call." Susan clenched her jaw, her carefully composed expression beginning to falter. Jordan could see it now, the hesitation, the creeping doubt flickering in Susan's eyes. A realization taking root. Maybe, just maybe, they had gravely miscalculated. Jordan seized the moment. "I think that's an excellent idea," she said, giving Maurice a small nod. But before another word could be spoken, the heavy glass doors of the bank swung open, and a man in a tailored suit strode inside, his expression tense. David Ramirez, the bank's regional director. Jordan's phone had never left her bag, but clearly, Maurice had sounded the alarm up the chain. David's sharp gaze swept across the bank, locking onto her, and in an instant, his entire demeanor shifted. His face paled, his breath hitched, and then, in a hushed, almost disbelieving voice, he whispered, "Oh my God!" He took a halting step forward. "Miss Carter." The room fell into complete silence. Heads turned. Customers who had been subtly observing now openly gawked. Jason stiffened like a deer caught in headlights. Susan's face went completely white. David rushed forward, nearly knocking over a chair in his haste. I am so sorry. I didn't realize." Jordan remained impassive, her gaze unwavering as she met his frantic eyes. "You didn't realize what, David?" Susan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jason, who had been so smug just minutes ago, looked as if he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. David swallowed hard, his lips parting and closing as he fumbled for words. His eyes flickered from Susan to Jason, desperation creeping into his expression. I, I had no idea that you were... Jordan held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. No, she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Finish that sentence. You had no idea I was what exactly? David hesitated, visibly struggling. His silence was deafening. Jordan let it stretch out, ensuring they all felt the weight of it. Then she spoke again, her tone smooth but carrying the force of thunder. I walked into my own bank. I followed every protocol, presented valid identification, requested access to my own money. And yet, she turned to Susan, then to Jason. You decided I didn't belong. You decided I wasn't legitimate. You decided that my money, my success, was somehow suspect. Jason's mouth opened and closed uselessly. No excuses left to offer. Susan, normally poised, looked utterly unraveled. Miss Carter, Susan finally choked out, her voice brittle. I assure you, this was just a misunderstanding. Jordan let out a low, humorless chuckle. A misunderstanding? She turned, gesturing toward the growing crowd of onlookers. Raise your hand if you think this was just a misunderstanding. Not a single hand went up. Susan's shoulders slumped. Jason's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. David exhaled sharply, stepping forward again. Miss Carter, please, let me personally apologize. I don't want an apology, David, Jordan interrupted, her voice smooth as silk but cutting as glass. I want accountability. She leaned forward slightly, resting her palms on the counter. Because let's be very clear, if I had been anyone else, another black woman, a Latina, a Middle Eastern man, if I had been someone who didn't fit into your narrow little world, you wouldn't be scrambling to apologize right now. You'd be calling the cops. You'd be letting them haul me away in handcuffs in front of everyone here. Jason flinched as if the words had struck him. Susan recoiled. David, visibly uncomfortable, rubbed the back of his neck. Miss Carter, I take full responsibility for this, and I can assure you... Jordan's gaze locked onto him like a vice. Oh, I know you do, David. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Because this... She gestured between herself, Susan, and Jason. This isn't an isolated incident. This isn't some rogue mistake. This is systemic. This is the culture you have allowed to fester in my bank. And that means it starts from the top. So tell me, David. Her voice softened, but the weight of her words hit like a sledgehammer. How many times has this happened before? Silence. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath. Maurice, who had been standing quietly, suddenly averted his gaze, pressing his lips into a thin line. Jordan caught the gesture. He had seen it before. She straightened, shifting her gaze back to Susan and Jason. Well, she asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Jason's voice finally emerged, though it was shaky. I was just following policy, he stammered. Jordan lifted a brow. Which policy is that, exactly? The one that says black customers should be treated as criminals, while white customers are welcomed like VIPs? Jason's face burned red. Susan, frantic now, jumped in. That's not fair. Jordan let out a sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. Not fair, Susan. None of this is fair. Her voice rang through the space, firm and unyielding. Susan's lips pressed into a thin, wobbly line. Jordan's next words were deliberate. Here's what's going to happen right now. Susan tensed. Jason barely breathed. David looked as though he were bracing for impact. Jordan reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. With a few taps, she turned the screen toward them, displaying something unmistakable. A live video recording. Susan gasped. Jason's eyes widened in horror. David's breath caught in his throat. The reckoning had just begun. Jordan lifted her phone, her expression unreadable, as she tapped the screen a few times before turning it around to face them. The display lit up, showing a live video recording. This is going straight to our internal team, she announced, her voice steady but charged with authority. I want this footage reviewed, this entire branch investigated, and every single customer who has faced discrimination here to receive immediate accountability. Jason's face lost all color. Susan visibly stiffened. Jordan turned to Maurice, locking eyes with the security guard. "How often do you see things like this?" she asked. Maurice hesitated, shifting his weight before rubbing his chin. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet but firm. "More than I should." Susan's head snapped toward him. "Maurice!" He raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm just being honest." Jordan gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before shifting her gaze to David. The regional director was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Miss Carter, I can personally guarantee that this will be addressed immediately," David assured her. Jordan studied him for a long, measured moment before responding. "I know it will," she said smoothly, "because if it isn't, I'll be handling you." David visibly swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he nodded quickly. As Jordan turned her attention back to Susan. "You're fired!" Susan reeled back as if struck. "Wait, what?" Jordan didn't blink. "Effective immediately. Clear out your desk." Susan opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jordan pivoted to Jason. "You're on immediate probation. You will undergo mandatory racial bias training and a full performance review. If I receive even one more complaint about how you treat customers, you're gone." Jason's shoulders slumped in defeat, his lips pressing into a thin line. Jordan turned back to Maurice. "And you," she said, "are getting a promotion." Maurice's eyes widened. "Wait, for real?" A small smile tugged at Jordan's lips. "For real. I need people in leadership who actually see what's happening and aren't afraid to speak up." Maurice exhaled, still processing. He gave a slow, determined nod. David stepped forward again. "Miss Carter, I assure you—" Jordan silenced him with a sharp look. "Fix this." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. Jordan exhaled and took a step back, scanning the bank. Customers still watched in stunned silence. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, and Jason and Susan stood frozen in place, their fates sealed. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about every black and brown person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to be in. And Jordan Carter wasn't about to let that slide. Not in her bank, not ever again. She turned back to David. "This isn't just about this branch. I want a full audit of every Carter Financial location. I want real reports on customer interactions. If there are patterns of racial bias, I want them identified and addressed immediately." David swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." Jordan glanced at Morris. "I want you involved in this. You've seen it firsthand. You know what needs to change." Morris blinked, taken aback. "Me?" Jordan nodded. "You've worked here long enough to know what's really happening behind closed doors. I need eyes on the ground. You're getting promoted to customer experience supervisor. Every complaint, every report, every incident, you oversee it." Maurice's lips parted in shock. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Jordan replied simply. A slow smile spread across his face. "Yes." Satisfied, Jordan turned to the customers, still watching. "I want to thank you all for your patience today," she said, her voice carrying through the space. "What happened here is exactly the kind of thing too many people face every day. But here's what's different today. There were consequences." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Some customers nodded, others still had their phones raised, capturing every second. Jordan continued, "I started Carter Financial to be different, to be better. And I refuse to let this bank become another institution that treats black and brown customers like second-class citizens." A few scattered claps broke out. In the back, an older black woman smiled at her, and Jordan felt something shift deep inside her. She wasn't just fixing a problem, she was protecting her legacy. She turned back to David. "Make sure every single employee undergoes real racial bias training. I'm not talking about some lazy checkbox seminar. I want experts. I want real conversations happening." David nodded quickly. "Understood." "And one more thing," Jordan added. David tensed. "What kind of policy?" Jordan's lips curved into a knowing smirk. "Starting today, every Carter Financial branch will have secret shopper audits. Any employee caught treating customers differently based on race, gender, or appearance?" She tilted her head. "They're out." David let out a slow breath. Got it. Jason finally spoke, his voice small. Miss Carter, I didn't mean... Jordan's sharp gaze cut him off. You did, she said simply. You just didn't think you'd get caught. Jason looked down, his face burning with shame. Susan finally found her voice. Miss Carter, I've been with this bank for over a decade. Please, if there's anything I can do... Jordan held up a hand, stopping her. Susan, she said, her tone unwavering. You had a decade to do better. You didn't. Silence. She turned to Maurice. Escort them out. Maurice hesitated, then nodded. With pleasure. Jason and Susan shuffled toward the exit, their faces filled with disgrace. The moment the doors swung shut behind them, the energy in the room shifted. Jordan exhaled, turning back to David. Get everything I asked for in motion. I want updates by Monday morning. Yes, ma'am, David said quickly. As Jordan turned to leave, an elderly black man stepped forward, gripping a wooden cane. His wise eyes studied her with quiet admiration. Miss Carter, he said, his voice rough with age. Thank you. Jordan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything hit her all at once. She smiled softly. No need to thank me, sir. This is just the beginning. And with that, she walked out, knowing she had just made history.